He is one of the most famous people on the planet, not just a world leader, but a military leader, and the face, we're told, of global democracy. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan. He is unmistakable, as Volodymyr Zelenskyy is always wearing olive green, whether sweatsuits or some kind of military uniform. Mostly it's just green, a uniform he wears all the time, really no matter the event, whether speaking before a joint session of the United States Congress, or he's at a black tie gala, or ringing the bell of the New York Stock Exchange. He is always dressed for battle. He really is. People the world over know exactly who he is the moment they see him. But how many know anything about this man? Just who is Volodymyr Zelenskyy? Well, we're told he is an aggrieved, selfless servant of the Ukrainian people. By the way, remember that term. Bravely defending his democratic nation against the cruel invasion of his bully neighbor. This neighbor, we're told, really is the exact opposite of our fearless war hero. Vladimir Putin, you could call him Darth Vader, to Volodymyr Zelenskyy's Luke Skywalker. And like a young Jedi, our hero has boyish good looks and humble origins. We have been handed a laughably simple narrative here. You know, it's easy to digest. It makes for a cut and dry case of good versus evil. But you know, experience tells us something. It tells us that although simple narratives are useful for things like, selling a war, they're not so great at telling the whole story or the true story. In this 12-part series, Zelenskyy Unmasked, will reveal another side to not just the leader of Ukraine, but to the entire war effort itself. Why has the United States and Western Europe pushed so hard for war in Ukraine? And why won't they call for the war's end? Is Ukraine really a bastion of Jeffersonian democracy, or is it actually run more like a tyrannical regime? And why are U.S. taxpayers, people like you and me, continuing to send billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to a war effort that seems really, when you break it down, more like a money laundering scheme? Here at Truth in Media, we've been looking into this story for over a year, researching, digging, and following the facts where others won't. The questions I just laid out for you, we will answer. So our first question today, who is Volodymyr Zelenskyy?
Total creation of the West.
Well, he was selected to act in this role, and he's doing a fantastic job as an actor. Quite frankly, this is a role of a lifetime, and he's killing it.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy was born in 1978 in Kryvyi Rih, an industrial city in the south of Ukraine. Like most others in the region, Zelenskyy grew up speaking Russian and wasn't fluent in Ukrainian until he took a crash course on the language while he was running for president. Zelenskyy studied law in college and graduated in 2000. He was active in one of his college's theater groups called Quarter 95. In 2003, Zelenskyy started his own production company named after his improv group. In 2012, he and his company joined Ukrainian network 1+1, owned by one of Ukraine's most notorious oligarchs, Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky has been accused of a number of crimes, ranging from embezzlement to murder.
Zelenskyy was picked by this oligarch Kolomoisky. He's also the same man that has funded Azov, which to me makes no sense because this oligarch is Jewish.
3 years after Zelenskyy joined Kolomoisky's company, he starred in the network's hit TV series called The Servant of the People. I told you to remember that name. It was about a teacher who unwittingly becomes a viral sensation for being caught ranting on camera about corruption in Ukraine.
Василий Петрович Голобородько?
Да.
Доброе утро, господин президент.
Well, get this. A few years later, Zelenskyy's production company registered a political party called Servant of the People, just like their hit show. Zelenskyy became the frontrunner in the 2019 election as soon as he announced his candidacy. That announcement was made during a special broadcast aired on Kolomoisky's network. During this time, war had been raging in the Donbas region of Ukraine since 2014. In that year, a coup ousted the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, a Russian ally. An ultra-nationalist Ukraine regime took over, and the ethnic Russian region of the Donbas refused to recognize the coup government. An intense civil war broke out. Thousands were killed. It's a civil war that raged from 2014 until 2022. 5 years after the start of that civil war and on the campaign trail, candidate Zelenskyy made peace his #1 priority.
I just supported him because he wanted peace in Ukraine. And that was the main thing why people in Ukraine supported him. More than 70% of people wanted peace.
He promised, I will talk to President Putin. I will meet with the Russians. We will end this war. And once he became president, he seems to have done a 180-degree change and has been the obedient servant of Washington.
So Zelenskyy won office as a pro-peace candidate, but then once elected, his tone changed, almost as if he was two different men. No longer an advocate for peace, the new president of Ukraine began arguing that his country needed to join NATO, even though Russia had long considered that to be a red line. That red line exists because Russia is surrounded by NATO from virtually every angle.
Коли українці будуть всі готові, ми обов'язково винесемо це питання на референдум, і Україна обов'язково буде в НАТО.
Although Zelenskyy is a native Russian speaker, he jumped on ultra-nationalist campaigns to curtail the use of his mother tongue. Let me tell you how he did this. So right before Zelenskyy took office in 2019, Ukraine passed a law making Ukrainian the mandatory language for use by government officials. This curbed the use of Russian. Now, I want to show you something else, because what many in the West fail to understand is that this is a major problem, because 22% of Ukrainians speak Russian as their native language. The law also outlawed teaching in Russian and required everyone in the country learn Ukrainian. Under Zelenskyy's watch, in January of 2021, that 2019 law was expanded, requiring service industry employees to talk to customers in Ukrainian first. According to the law, this is not a suggestion, this is law, they could only switch languages if customers asked to switch. Then the following year, another law was passed, which required domestic media to print in Ukrainian. In June of 2022, Zelenskyy signed another discriminatory decree, this one restricting the availability of Russian books and Russian music. Laws seeking the eradication of Russian culture and language are indicative of how radical nationalism has entered the mainstream of Ukrainian society.
You know, and really, you know, it's amazing to see, you know, and I think that, you know, 8 years ago, there was a lot less pro-Nazi, anti-Russian sentiment than there is today. And they just really pumped up the propaganda, and a lot of people that didn't used to believe it are now believing it.
After reversing earlier positions on language, Zelenskyy's image was further tarnished with the release of 2021's Pandora Papers. According to leaked documents, Zelenskyy and his inner circle held 10 offshore shadow companies which did business with Zelenskyy's old boss, the oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky was accused of stealing $5.5 billion from investors in a pyramid scheme he orchestrated through his bank. This led to accusations that Zelenskyy was getting rich off Kolomoisky's crimes. Through these shell companies, Zelenskyy and his partners reportedly purchased about $8 million worth of real estate in London. By October of 2021, Zelenskyy, who was elected with 73% of the vote, again under promises to bring peace to the Donbas region and to end corruption in Ukraine, had failed to deliver on his promises. He had, in fact, done the opposite, and his approval rating hovered at around 27%. But then, just 4 months later, the story surrounding Volodymyr Zelenskyy dramatically changed. Russia crossed Ukraine's border with soldiers and tanks in what the Russian government called a special military operation, and then it happened. Zelenskyy traded his suit and tie for olive green. Well, kind of olive green everything, right? And overnight became a darling of Western media. The timing was perfect. In fact, maybe too perfect.
So he's put forward as a, it's the traditional Marvel Comics hero-villain scenario. He's a hero, he's a good guy, stands for everything good, and he's attacked by the equivalent of Lex Luthor in a Superman movie, which would be the evil Vladimir Putin. And they've been, pretty successful with that in the United States simply because that's the only story that's allowed to get out.
So Zelenskyy was made into a hero, and Russia was labeled the aggressor, wanting only to rebuild the old Soviet Union. But the truth is that the 2022 invasion was far from unprovoked. Despite what you're going to hear in establishment mainstream media, Russia had spent decades warning of dire consequences if NATO continued to expand, and months urging the United States and NATO to formally declare that Ukraine would not join their military alliance. Only months after Russia's 2022 invasion, there were signs that this conflict would be a short-lived one. Reports came out that Ukraine and Russia were coming to a peace agreement. Foreign Affairs stated that, quote, according to multiple former senior U.S. officials we spoke with, in April of 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appeared to have tentatively agreed on the outline of a negotiated interim settlement.
In fact, Ukraine was already touting that, okay, we've almost got agreement, we have this and that that's not quite agreed. And then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, came flying into Kiev unannounced, and he had to sit down with Zelenskyy and told him in no uncertain terms, you're going to get back to war, cut out this business of talking peace.
Here's former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett discussing the Ukraine-Russia peace deal, which he says was sabotaged.
צריך להמשיך להכות בפוטין ולא להגיע, אבל שאל מול, זאת אומרת, הגישה היותר תקיפה, אני אגיד לך משהו, אני לא יודע להגיד שהם שגו, ומתווך, אבל הכתובת שלי זה אמריקה בעניין הזה, ואני לא פועל על דעת עצמי. כל פעולה שעשיתי הייתה מתואמת לפרטי פרטים, גם עם ארצות הברית, גם עם גרמניה, גם עם צרפת.
אז הם בעצם חדלו את זה?
בגדול, כן. בגדול הם חדלו את זה.
Had the United States and Great Britain not intervened at that moment, had the peace talks been allowed, this war would have ended with some minor boundary changes. Of course, Crimea would have gone back to Russia, where it's always belonged. Portions of the Donbass would have gone to Russia. But for the most part, stability would have been restored.
After it was declared that peace was not an option, the deaths mounted and repression escalated.
I had to flee Ukraine in last year, not because of the Russians, but because I was threatened I had death threats to my life. And I had to flee Ukraine because I wanted peace.
Gonzalo Lira was a popular Chilean-American blogger who died as a political prisoner in Ukraine. His alleged crime was that he voiced opinions online that differed from the Ukrainian government. Lira granted us an exclusive interview a year after he was detained for the first time. And here's what he said to us when we asked about the possibility of false flag operations being conducted by Ukraine's military.
They arrested me, they interrogated me, and I was, released, but the fact is that, how can I put this carefully? I don't want to create the conditions or the excuse to lose my liberty at this time. And so I'm going to have to decline. After this conflict is over, I'm happy to tell you exactly incidents that I think were not what they were claimed to be.
Soon after this interview, Lira was arrested and imprisoned. In messages posted to his Twitter account after he was released on bail, Lira claimed that he was beaten and tortured while in custody. He recorded this message on July 31st, 2023, just 3 months after our interview.
So either I will cross the border into Hungary in the next couple of hours, or I will be arrested again, and God knows what will happen to me.
Lira didn't make it to Hungary. He was rearrested for breaching the terms of his bail, and he died while imprisoned just months after he recorded this message. Lira is not alone in facing persecution for voicing criticism toward Kiev. Opposition political parties and politicians have been banned in Ukraine, and Ukraine's parliament has even voted to shut down the Orthodox Church. In December of 2022, Ukraine passed a law forbidding religious organizations from having ties with Russia. In the aftermath of this law's passage, several priests were arrested and 50 people were interrogated. In March of 2023, Ukraine's most historic monastery, the Kiev Petrus Lavra, was raided and parts of it were shut down. Metropolitan Pavel Lebed is the head of the Orthodox Church in Kiev. He granted us an interview 2 days before he was arrested.
Меня спросили, когда я виделся с Путиным. Я им ответил, тогда, когда и вы. Когда Путин приезжал в Киев, то вы общались, я не общаюсь и не имею никакого отношения.
Nearly a year into Russia's war with Ukraine, and now most analysts are quietly admitting that Ukraine has no chance, despite the massive numbers of weapons, tanks, defense systems, and don't forget the $100 billion poured in by the United States and Western Europe. Russia has control over most of the Donbass region, and Ukraine's much-hyped counteroffensive has been an utter failure. This isn't a surprise. Many analysts who didn't make it onto mainstream media outlets predicted Ukraine's loss as soon as the conflict started. Given this stalemate, territorial control now currently divided on lines that have been previously agreed to by Russia and Ukraine, the question remains, why is this war still going on?
Well, it seems very obvious that they didn't shell out all that cash to Zelenskyy in like big bags or something like that, right? Most of it is going to the American military-industrial complex.
К сожалению, что сегодня нету политиков, а есть политиканты, на котором на смертях, на войне зарабатывают деньги. Вы это прекрасно знаете, не мне вам говорить, что это делается и сегодня, как списывают и на продукты питания, и на оружие, а все ложится на плечи людей, простых людей. А вот некоторые, которые дорываются до власти, они это все делают, но забывая о том, что они ответят перед Богом за все.
They will answer to God for everything, he says. So who are they? The they who created the cult of Ukraine's wartime president. We'll investigate and give you details no one else will in our next episode, as we promise to leave Zelenskyy unmasked.